Hi, it's Julie here, and this is going to be a session on stress, and we're going to look at the biology and the psychology of stress and the impact of it, and then some of the various ways of understanding it. So I'm just going to screen share now. There we go. So we're going to be looking at how we define stress, some of the life changes that cause it. Yeah, so let's start off by defining stress. So you might want to press pause here and just think about how you would define stress. So if you want to press pause, then do that. Some of the definitions for stress are that it's a state of psychological and physical, so it's body and brain affected by stress, you probably know that, where there's a mismatch between the perceived demands of a situation and our ability to cope with that, but it's our perceived ability to cope. So one person might feel really stressed by tying their shoelaces because that feels outside of their perceived ability to tie their shoelaces, whereas somebody else, it might just be simple. And so it's anything that triggers the stress response. So it could be life changes, daily hassles, and we'll talk a bit more about those. But it is different for everybody. So you might want to just think about what your stresses are, things that cause you stress at the moment, and how you know you're stressed. So if you want to press pause, so a stressor is anything, it could be standing in a queue at Tesco's, could be waiting for your COVID vaccine, it could be, you know, trying to work from home and having children around you, but it could also be something more major like an illness. But also then, how do you know your signs of stress? So what happens in your body, what happens in your mind, what happens in your relationships, what happens behaviourally. So press pause and have a think, make a note, and then come back to this. Okay. So obviously there's different images here of different types of stressors. Some of us go all snarly, like, you know, some of us cry, some of us get headaches. And so we're going to have a look at those. So we're going to understand why some of the, you know, some of you might get headaches, some of you might get a sick tummy, some of you might feel stiff, some of you might stop sleeping, and so we'll talk a bit more about why those things are as we go through, so hopefully make sense of it for you. But let's first of all understand what happens in your brain. So you've got your brain, and there's three areas of your brain. The bit behind your forehead is called the neocortex, and it's the most recently developed part of our brain structure. It's different from animals who tend to have smaller bits of neocortex, and this is our ability to process information, to think with words and sequences, and to be able to problem solve. We've then got the limbic brain, which we share with mammals and other more developed creatures, so that where we've got our senses and we've got our emotional memory. So that's why, you know, you can smell fresh bread and it reminds you of being somewhere, or for me it's the smell of suntan lotion always reminds me of the sun. That's our limbic brain. And then we've got the reptilian brain, which is the amygdala, which is part of our brain, which is our survival brain. So fight, flight, freeze and flock. And this is, it's this part of our brain is to keep us safe, keep us alive. That's its intention. And so when we perceive a threat, our brain is wired as if we were Stone Age people, but actually it could even be feeling overwhelmed by an essay, or you know, having to go to the shops during COVID and feeling worried about that. So it doesn't need to be a grizzly bear that feels threatening. Remember, the definition is something that feels bigger than our ability to manage it or control it. That will make you feel stressed. So some of the signs and symptoms which you might have: increased heart rate, pounding heart, blood pressure would go up if, you know, if we could measure that. Sweaty palms, tightness in the chest, neck, jaw, back, headache, diarrhea, constipation. Urinary hesitancy just means we can't go to the toilet, but often it's the other as well. We can't stop going to the toilet. Trembling, being easily startled, chronic pain. Chronic means ongoing. So it could be twitching, stuttering and other speech difficulties, feeling sick, being sick, sleep disturbances, fatigue, shallow breathing, dryness of the mouth or throat. You might be more susceptible to getting minor illnesses, having cold hands and twitching. And so then you've got to start thinking, well, why? So we're going to talk about all that in a minute. So physical symptoms, you might get irritable, angry, hostile, depressed, jealous, restless, withdrawn. You might not be able to see the positive. Your self-esteem might go down. Emotional responses and reflexes might be kind of numbed. You might be less likely to be positive. You might be anxious, might not be able to take the initiative. You might feel either hypervigilant, over alert, you know, really watching out for stuff, or things might feel a bit unreal. You might see that you don't want to get involved with other people. There might be a lack of interest, a tendency to cry, being critical of other people, nightmares, impatience, reduced self-esteem, insomnia, and changes in eating. This is information that we've got from OCR, the exam board. So you can Google lots of other signs and symptoms, and you'll probably know those yourself. The cognitive symptoms, cognitives are anything to do with thinking. You might feel forgetful, blocked, blurred vision. Preoccupied means worried. You might have errors. You not be able to judge things so well, including distances. You may not be able to imagine things, or you might be over imagining things. Reduced creativity, lack of concentration, diminished productivity, lack of attention to detail, orientation to the past, so kind of ruminating, going back over things. Decreased psychomotor reactivity and coordination, so you know, you might hear someone shout but not respond. Attention deficit, disorganized thought, negative self-esteem, kind of maybe you can't find a meaning to life. Lack of control or needing too much control, and lots of negative self-talk. And behavioural systems, the behaviour is how we act. So we might start doing some of the things that we know are bad for us. So increased smoking, being aggressive, so shouting at people, or road rage, alcohol use, carelessness, undereating, overeating, nervous laughter, compulsive behaviour. So, you know, whether that's shopping or scratching, impatience with yourself and other people, withdrawal, becoming listless, hostile, accident prone. You can see stress has enormous effects, but we must also remember that stress isn't always bad. You know, there's eustress is positive stress, and it helps us perform, it helps us kind of get psyched up for job interviews. But then distress is when that kind of can decrease our performance and our ability. So it's not that all stress is bad, it obviously is when it's used in a way that isn't helpful to us. And there's a stress curve here. So it's like an upside down U, and the idea is that the stress is along the bottom, and then performance. If we're not stressed at all, then we're not really going to be performing. So if you've got a really boring job, or then you're not really being challenged, so you're not really learning. So it's the middle of that upside down U that you want to be in, where there is stress and there is challenge, and then that's going to push your performance. But obviously, as you start to come down the other side of the U, if it's too much stress and too much pressure and you feel like you can't do it, that's when you're going to start, your performance is going to go down again. So hopefully you can see there that actually it's a bit, we need to be in the middle a bit. So it's like with work, if you've got a job that's too easy for you, you're going to be bored, frustrated, you know, time's going to drag. But if you're in a job as well that's in too, you know, way above your head, then that's going to be really stressful. So you need something that's going to challenge you, but isn't going to overwhelm you. Okay, so what's it all about, stress? Well, it's an evolved survival system. It's innate. Our response to stress is innate. I've talked a bit about epigenetics before, and epigenetics, remember, is where we pass things between generations. So there is epigenetic research to say that if a mother was pregnant in a stressful situation, then the child is born more likely to respond to stress. So you can see that that would be adaptationally useful, because it means the child's going to be born more risk averse. And so we're kind of, you know, we would have been hunted as primates when we were you know, hunter-gatherers. We would have been hunted by predators, but also we were hunters, or we still are hunters. And so that's why we need our fight and flight response, and that's still active. And you could say in some ways we are still hunters and hunted. You know, in the workplace there'll be those who are kind of sometimes bullying, so they would make us feel like we're hunted, and sometimes it might be us that are being bullying or dominant, so maybe then we're the hunters. So it's an evolutionary response. And if we go back to that picture of the brain, what happens when we're stressed is our neocortex is deactivated. Our IQ drops by something like 30%. So we're less able to think clearly and plan and make decisions, and we're much more likely to just go into fight and flight, which is this adaptive evolutionary response. And we're just going to react, which is why we sometimes do things that we wish we hadn't done when we're stressed, because we're not thinking straight. Okay. So Hans Selye was the first person who looked at stress, and this is way back in the 1920s. And he was working with rats and was interested in what was the impact of stress on rats. And so he put the rats under biological conditions, too hot, too cold, kind of deprived them of sleep. And he said that stress is a non-specific response to the body of any demand. So if again, back to demands being greater than we think we can handle. And so the rat, obviously, as a mammal, has the same physical sensations as us, obviously cognitively different. Would not have such a complex neocortex, but would have the ability to problem solve. Rats are pretty good at mazes and problem solving, that sort of thing. So they've got some of that ability. That's who he was doing his work on. And so he was looking at no matter what happens in the stress that would translate. And so Hans Selye, if you want to pause now and go away and do some Googling for yourself, he came up with the general adaptation syndrome. So if you want to press pause and go and find out about that. Okay. So the 3 stages that he came up with are alarm, which is where we're startled, where we realise that there's a threat. And then we've got the resilience or the resistance, which is where we try to cope with it. And then we get to exhaustion. And so he noticed that to start off with, the rats would try and, they'd be alerted to the stressor. They would try and then deal with the stressor, but eventually they become exhausted. And if the stress continued, what he found was that the rats died. And I'll explain a bit about the biology of that as we get there. So how do we understand what was going on in the rats? Well, for us too, and I'm going to link this to some of your signs and symptoms now. So as your heart rate goes up, because you're stressed, you spot a stressor, your heart rate goes up because we need to get blood round your body so that you can either fight or you can fly. So what that means is your limbs might start to tremble or start to shake or start to tense up, and that's because we're wanting to fight or fly. That's what our body's trying to do. Our blood also becomes better at clotting, because again, if we're going in to fight a grizzly bear, then if it scratches us, we don't want to be bleeding to death. So the reason we get a sicky feeling in our stomach or need the toilet more or less is because, and what the reason we get a dry mouth is that our digestive system shuts down, because it's just not really useful. If you're fighting a grizzly bear, evolutionarily, whether you're digesting your food is neither here nor there. And so that stops temporarily and then kind of restarts. Fuzzy thinking, again, is where the brain, your body's gone into overdrive, your body's taken over rather than your brain. We convert sugar to energy, and some of the reason we get tension headaches is because the muscles around our shoulders tighten, because we're either bringing our shoulders up to fight or to fly. So again, if there's lots of YouTube videos you can watch have a look at this. So general adaptation syndrome, as we've said, so alarm is the fight and flight syndrome. What's happening? What am I going to do about it? And at this point, our blood pressure drops, our muscle tension increases. We then kick into our stress response, which is then we're like, okay, I'm stressed now, what am I going to do about it? So that our adrenaline starts flowing, that's when our heart rate goes up. Okay, so we've already touched on how, for example, the blood, because we're then into fight and flight mode, our pupils dilate, as you can see on there, so that we can see the threats more clearly. We've already talked a bit about why our digestive system stops. Our lungs start to breathe more effectively because we need to get oxygen around to our muscles, and we start sweating because we're going into fight or flight mode. Okay, so stressors. So your stressors might be, you know, shopping at Tesco's rather than a grizzly bear, but your brain perceives it as a stressor. So that sends a message to your hypothalamus. So your hypothalamus is the part of your body and your brain that's interested in homeostasis. So if we're too hot, we sweat. If we're too cold, we shiver. If we're hungry, we get, you know, an empty tummy growl and we eat. And then when we're full, we should stop eating. So the hypothalamus is all to do with homeostasis, wanting your body to stay equal. And so this now goes, oh, here's a threat. And so the hypothalamus activates the pituitary gland, which releases ACTH. Which then goes to the neocortex, and I'll go into this in a bit more detail in a secondary video. So the adrenal cortex, your adrenal glands are on top of your kidney. You've got 2 kidneys and 2 adrenal glands, and the adrenal cortex is the outside of the adrenal gland, and that releases cortisol. And that's what causes long-term stress, and we'll come back to that, because long-term stress is not going to be like someone pulling out in front of you, you know, at crossroads and you have to slam your brakes on. That's acute stress. Chronic stress is probably what we're all feeling a bit under lockdown, or work-based stressors, or if you're a student, you've got your exam stressors. So it's just where it feels relentless, and that's when we start to produce cortisol. Okay, acute stress is where someone shouts at us and it's passed quickly, or you know, where we have to stop our child running out into the road, and so we react. And so that's because it has to happen much quicker, it's a much shorter route. So it's the hypothalamus that spots the threat, and it goes straight to the adrenal medulla, which is the middle bit of the adrenal gland, which reduces noradrenaline and adrenaline, which means we then react much quicker. So you can see that the similarities in the pathways, but the fight and flight one is much quicker. So this is the fight and flight one is called the sympathomedullary pathway, SAM. The way I remember that is it's like fireman Sam has to get there and put the fire out. And then if you look at the chronic stress, there's lots of C's in the chronic stress. So it's the pituitary gland reduces ACTH, which goes to the adrenal cortex, which releases cortisol, which is for chronic. So anything to do with C on the whole is the chronic stressor, and then the sympathomedullary pathway is got all the A's in, so that's adrenaline, and it goes to the medulla. It's got an A at the end. So it's SAM, it's an emergency, so it's got to be A first thing. It's just how I remember it. The chronic stress one is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system. For short, you'll be relieved to know that's the HPA system. Okay, so here we go. The cerebral cortex detects the stressor, the hypothalamus spots it, it sends a message to the adrenal glands on the top of what we're doing. Oh, sorry about that distraction there. So yeah, we've got it triggers the adrenal medulla, and you can see that it's on top of the kidneys, and that's how we become stressed. You can also see the effect it has in your indigestion. So chronic stress, we often get indigestion, and that's literally because our body is shut down digesting for so long that it starts to cause cause digestive problems. And you can see in this close up here of the adrenal medulla, the cortex, remember, is the C, so that's to do with cortisol, which is to do with chronic stress, and then the inside bit is M, so the middle, and that's to do, it's got an A at the end, so it's medulla or medular, so it's to do with acute stress, is the way that I remember it. And the hypothalamus is the part of the brain that sends out a signal to release So just going back to that then, so the hypothalamus spots the stress reaction. It releases corticotrophin, and it stimulates the anterior pituitary gland. ACTH is released and travels through your bloodstream. That affects your adrenal medulla and your cortisol, adrenal cortex, releasing cortisol. And then your corticosteroids reduce down fat reserves, because you would need those fats to process glycogen. So they provide glycogen and glucose, which gives your body energy. And so this kind of links in with what Hans Selye was finding with his rats, is that the same things were happening to them, and that they, you know, that's why we can, when we're under chronic stress, feel tired and irritable all the time. We might get shoulder and neck pain, and that's because we're tense, ready to fight or fly. And that's also why we might get circulatory disorders, because the blood's not pumping around fast enough. So the second stage, so the alarm is resistance, where we really try to fight, and that's what we've just been describing, where we're trying to function under stress. But cortisol across a long period of time can really interfere with our immune response. One of the biggest things we can do for ourselves during this time of COVID is to actually just you know, keep our stress levels as low as possible, which of course is a joke when we're all homeschooling and working online, and there's multiple stressors. But the higher your stress, and we'll look at some research in this, the higher your stress, the lower your immunity. And so there's research to show that wounds get worse. Wound healing is less the more stressed we are. So initially, when we're in the acute stress stage, that blood clotting which stops us bleeding, that acute stress, when we're actually in a fight, actually then our immunity is quite high. But the idea, obviously, in acute stressor, like being in a fight or an accident, stress would pass, and then we'd get to rest and digest, and we'd get to recover. But in chronic stress, where the stress continues, we never get that come down of rest, and so actually then that's when wounds don't heal, and we feel ill. And then we reach the exhaustion stage. So exhaustion is where literally we've worn our body down. You might have heard about endocrine fatigue or adrenal fatigue, and it's literally where we've been almost like had our foot on the pedal of the car for so long that we're going to ruin the engine and we run out of fuel. So this is where we start to get mouth ulcers, stomach ulcers. You might pick up viral infections, where literally we're kind of eating away at our own body. Some of the long-term effects of stress, we might find that you get, you know, your skin might flare up. Long-term stress, you're at increased risk of heart attack, sexual problems, lack of desire, or, you know, kind of compulsive sexual practices like pornography. Diabetes might rise because we're not processing glycogen and glucose as effectively. Might cause eczema and asthma to flare up, and your weight might change. Also, things like mood might change, irritability, concentration, headaches, increase in blood pressure, stomach cramps. Bone density can be affected because we're not digesting properly, because our digestive system's not functioning, so we're not getting, particularly as women, we're not getting vitamins that we need to keep our bone density there, and we might feel achy. And then things like PTSD. So PTSD is a particular type of stress, post-traumatic stress, and we're not really going to go into this here because it is a special category really. But you might get things like irritable bowel, depression here. Some people even come out in hives when they're really stressed. So there's white blotchy things you get from nettles. So Selye did this research right back at the beginning of the 1900s, and so it was brilliant that he spotted the stress research, but actually then he was ignored for quite a long time and nothing happened with the research. And because it was an animal study, people didn't necessarily extrapolate what does that mean for human beings, but obviously it does have relevance to human beings. So what we're going to have a brief look at now is, well, what are some of the stresses that cause human beings to be stressed? So Cousins et al. Did research on workplace stresses, and these 6 aspects are actually listed on the Health and Safety Executive site for workplace stress, and the HSE, Health and Safety Executive, is obviously there to legally protect workers, people on 0-hour contracts. It's tricky. It should in theory cover you, but obviously your work, in order for you to enforce it covering you, you have far fewer rights, which is one of the tricky things about those contracts. But some of the things that we've identified, demands and control, are the workload. So if the demand is too high, that can cause stress, or shift patterns, or a demanding work environment. If it's very noisy, very hot, very loud, like in a factory, that can cause stress. Control, how much the person has a say about how they do their job, can have an effect. So if you're the boss and you're in control, we'll look at research in a minute which says that you're less likely to be stressed. Of course, the amount of support and the kind of support and encouragement, and also the kind of resources. So if you've got enough resources, if the photocopier works, if your technology is working, then obviously that's all much less stressful. Relationships, so whether you get on with people at work, whether you enjoy working with them, that you know from your own experience has an effect. And role is an interesting one. So are you clear on what you're supposed to be doing? And one of the biggest causes of stress is role conflict, where one person's saying, oh, can you just do this? And the other person's saying, can you just do that? And you're thinking, which one am I supposed to be doing? And that can create tension. And that, of course, happens when you're a working parent, because you've got your parent role and you've got your work role, and often they come into conflict. And then change, none of us like change. Obviously the last year or so has seen nothing but change, and we felt very out of control of that change with COVID. So it depends on how that's been managed and communicated, and by and large, the more clearly it's communicated, the less stress there is. So you might want to just take a moment there and press pause, and what you can do is say, right, out of 10, where 10 is I'm really happy with this and 0 is I'm not happy at all, give yourself a mark out of 10 for how much, for example, you're dealing with the demands at work. So if I'm dealing with them brilliantly, it's just the right pitch for me, then that would be 10 out of 10. But for example, if you think, oh God, I have no control over anything in my life at the moment, you might want to give that a lower mark, just to sort of see what, because sometimes we think, oh, it's all of work that's really difficult, but actually may not be all of work. It may be a particular part of work that's difficult. So have a look at that. And so Cooper and Payne in 1988 came up with this idea, which then Karasek in 79, they were drawing on Karasek's research. So you can see here that where you've got low control and high demand, so a very demanding job and no control over how you do it, that's very stressful. So for example, for me, I remember working on a production line as one of my many student jobs. So the demand was to do with pace. We had to keep up with the pace. It wasn't a difficult job, but we had to keep up with the machine, and of course had no control over the pace of the machine. Where it's a boring job, so low control and low demand, that's just, so again, I've done those kind of part-time jobs where you're just stacking shelves, so that it's not very demanding. You've got to stack the shelves in a certain way, but it's just boring. you know, hours seem to drag. But then high control and low demand. So again, that's where, you know, you can organize it in a way that you want, but it's not a very demanding job. So again, quite boring, unsatisfying. So really, Karasek's work was suggesting that actually it's good to have some demand. If you think about the curve that we were just talking about there, you know, where we actually need a bit of challenge in order to be performing and learning, then having some demand but having some control as well is kind of the ideal job. Which leads us into personalities. Are the different types of personalities that deal differently with stress? So Friedman and Rosenharm came up with type A and type B theory, and what they said is, yeah, there is a difference. And so again, you can Google type A and type B behaviours. And what you'll see is that type A so you might recognise yourself as being predominantly type A. So this fits in with individual differences and looking at how we label and define people. The type A people tend to be competitive, ambitious, a bit impatient, can be hostile, but that's because they want to win and they want to be first, restless and pressured, so very time focused. So these are the people that are very busy. They don't like to not be doing anything. You know, they like to have their voices heard. They want to be first ones in the queue. So that's type A behaviours. Type B is kind of the opposite to that, where they're much more chilled out. They go with the flow. They quite like being playful. Don't have to achieve. They don't mind winning or losing. They just kind of enjoy playing the game. They tend to be quite reflective, and therefore their work tends to be a bit less stressful, and you know, life tends to be a bit less stressful. So it's interesting. If you Google the research, you'll also see the type C behaviours came along later as a criticism that these two types were too basic, and type C behaviours were very compliant and kind of didn't like to rock the boat and like to keep relationships smooth. And so type C behaviours seem to have a strong link to cancer. And what they found was that people with type C behaviours, they kind of would swallow their own emotion to keep everybody else happy. And it was almost like having emotions eating away at them, and there seemed to be a higher incidence of cancer amongst those patients. Type A people, it tended to be the heart attack people, the ones who didn't recover because they didn't have any downtime from their stress, just constantly stressed. There was an interesting piece of research, though, that found that where type A people were more likely to have the heart attacks than type B, but actually then they were much less likely to die from heart attacks than type B people. And there was some suggestion that maybe that's because type A people are more likely to go, right, there's a problem, what am I going to do about it? So change lifestyle, changed eating habits, etc. And so actually started to get better. So that's type A and type B is one way of seeing it. Kobasa's research was less about types and typologies, type A and type B. She was interested in behaviours and what might buffer people against stress. So the idea that people who saw stressful situations differently, so there was a cognitive component here and a behavioural approach here. So control, so if you think, for example, let's take COVID. So you can't control whether COVID's in England or not. You can't control what the government does or not. You can't control whether your kid's at home or at school, really. Most of us can't. There's lots of things outside of your control. But what Kobasa said is that the people that do better with stressful situations is they know what they can and they can't control, and they act accordingly. So if you know all those things are outside of your control, then you don't end up fighting it. So, you know, I've heard people fighting about whether it's fair or not fair that their kids are in school or not in school. Well, in a way, that's kind of pointless, because that's just the rule. That's just what it is. There's nothing you can do to change that. But you can control, you know, where you go, who you see, how close you get, whether you wear a mask, whether you wash your hands. And so Kobasa found that people who took more control were less likely to experience stress. And then commitment. So commitment was how involved for life and other people we are, but also committed to an action. So, you know, those people who during this pandemic have had a sense of meaning and purpose, whether that's looking after their family or doing a job or even volunteering or looking after neighbours, who've got that kind of commitment to something bigger than themselves, again, more likely to do better than people who don't have that. And finally, the third C is challenge. So people who are hardy, Kobasa found, saw life's stressors as challenges rather than problems. So I was listening to an amazing podcast this morning about Holocaust survivor. So she's in her 90s now, and she described it amazingly. She was 16 in the Holocaust camps. Her parents were taken off in gas on arrival, but she was determined that she had no control over what the Nazis did to her or any of that, but she decided that the way that she saw things she could control. So in her mind, she decided that she would see the prison guards as being actually the prisoners, that they were the ones that were trapped there, they were the ones whose minds were trapped in that situation, that they were trapped, and that actually she was free to think what she wanted to think and to perceive things if she wanted to perceive things. And so she did survive. She's the woman that wrote the book The Gift, and so she's gone on to live a long and full life and is herself a psychologist. So that's where she very much was saying, rather than thinking this is being done to me internally, so this is a very cognitive thing, you start to challenge and think, oh, how could I see this differently? So you know, so hardiness is a way that we can deal with stress. We'll look at some biological treatments for that in a bit, but the meditation is one of the things that has been going on for 2,000 years or more. People have been meditating and know that that makes them feel calmer, but we've now got the biological scans which show what goes on. So you can see in the left-hand images, the brain's very active, quite a lot of heat in the brain, whereas after meditation, even after 10 minutes of meditation, the brain's much calmer and stiller. And so this isn't just meditation, the process of kind of focusing on your breath. People, when they do it, so on my website, which is julieleone.com, there's lots of meditation videos if you want to have a go at any of those. People think that when they're meditating, they're meant to have a completely still mind, and you know, occasionally that happens to me for about a millisecond. Maybe the Dalai Lama is better at that, but basically meditation is the idea of every time your mind has wandered off to a thought, feeling, sensation, worry, you just keep bringing it back to watching the breath. So you don't have to have a clear mind to get these effects. Okay, and what this does, the research shows that not only does meditation calm your mind while you're doing it, it calms your mind afterwards and has long-term effects on your brain structure. So it actually starts to calm down your amygdala, makes it less reactive. The up-to-date research about some of this on trauma, so this isn't always the best thing for trauma, but things like running and singing, where we're actually using some of that adrenaline up, is brilliant. Also, crying is a brilliant thing when you're stressed. So just then, when I had to stop recording, and that was because someone had come to my door, and then I knew that person was coming, they delivered something, but they were meant to be coming later, and then I got them settled, and then they came back again, and just was like, but sometimes when we acknowledge the stress and we have a cry or we have a scream or we have a rant, and then it passes through. So the biological need to release that is another way to do it, but obviously doing it safely, so sort of shouting and slamming and screaming at people isn't the best way. So I'm just going to come out of this PowerPoint and I'm going to screen share another one, just where we can go into the biology of stress. I'll just screen share again. There we go. Okay. So we're just, some of this we've done. We're just going to go over it in a bit more, you know, kind of different way and look at some of the long-term effects of stress. Okay. So here we go again. We've got the stressor. This is acute stress, activates the autonomic nervous system. So the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, is the bit that we have no control over. It takes care of our digestion and our breathing and our heart rate. And then that causes the adrenal medulla to reduce adrenaline, noradrenaline, and then we get our fight and flight response. Noradrenaline increases pupil size, we sweat more, we take in more oxygen, our heart rate goes up, we convert glucose to glycogen. Okay, and then adrenaline is released, so our brains and our muscles get the oxygen and digestion suppressed. But then chronic stress, we've got this longer route that we've just already talked about. So the hypothalamus again, releasing CRF to the pituitary gland, which releases ACTH, which acts on the adrenal cortex, which then releases cortisol. So what's the long-term effect of that? Let's have a look at some research on that. So Keekott-Glaser did some research. So Keekott-Glaser is quite a big researcher on stress. So it was a natural experiment, and they were looking at medics before and after their exams. So they took blood samples 1 month before their exams, so that was meant to be a low stress period, and then took blood samples in a higher stress period, and they were looking for NK cells, so natural killer cells, which are the ones that protect our immunity. And they found that people that basically high stress, decrease natural killer cells. And so you might have heard during the pandemic, they've been talking about NK cells, and so there are autoimmune cells. This was also done, so she looked at married couples who had arguments, and found that people who argued healed less well than people who were supportive. So think about that in a long-term relationship that's healthy compared to a long-term relationship that's not so healthy. Okay, so Evans looked at another antibody which coats the surface of our lungs and mouth. So there was mild stress induced, and when there was a mild stressor but an acute stressor, so it was just short, they had to give a little talk to other students, so 10-minute talk, then actually that went up, so immunity temporarily went up. Over a longer stressful period, like preparation for exams, then immunity came down. So acute stress maybe upregulates, as we've said, because if we're fighting we want to be armoured, but actually long-term stress downregulates and so reduces immunity. And then Segerstrom and Miller did a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is a really massive analysis where you take lots of studies from all over the world. So it's secondary research, you don't generate the data, you look at other data that's generated. And they found over 30 years that short-term stress boosts the immune system, but long-term stress reduces it. And the longer stress, the worse the effects. Yeah, and Lazarus suggests why the relationship between health and illness is difficult to establish, is that there's obviously so many correlations between it. But I think I was again listening to a medical podcast, and the doctor on that was saying that he thought that 80% of the reasons people went to see him actually had a stress-related link. So if you think about stomach ulcers, if you think about addictions, everything from period kind of dysfunction or infertility, all of those things can be influenced by stress. And this is why it causes heart disease. So you've probably seen pictures like this. You've got a normal artery that's like a healthy tube that's flexible and it moves as your blood goes through it. And then what we get is this, I can never say it, atherosclerosis, which is where basically the arteries start to flare up. So we know that smoking can do this, and we also know that fats can do this, but we also know that stress can do it because of the way that the cortisol acts on the fat in your body, it starts to flare up your arteries, and then if you get a blood clot, it can't get through. So that's where your raised blood pressure and your heart attacks are more likely to come across. So, and strokes, of course. But of course, it's hard to look at, because often when you're stressed, you eat worse, and you might smoke and you might drink, and all of those things would have an effect. So we've got to look at you know, biologically what happens in the body, but also behaviorally, what are people doing. So here's some research on that. So here was a procedure. So this is William's piece of research. He looked at 13,000 people who'd had a heart attack, and 6 years later, of those, 656 had had a heart attack, and those who were highest on the anger scale were 2.5 times more likely to have had a heart attack. So if you go back to the idea that type A people are more likely to have a heart attack, actually this seems to suggest that it may not be any more than their anger and irritability at getting things done, that actually that's what causes that. And those moderate on the anger scale are 35% more likely to have a coronary event. So some suggestion there that, you know, there's a link between anger and stress and heart attack. Okay, then research in 1962 looked at work-related stress, and this is probably no surprise. So there's GPs and anaesthetists who were seen as the high stress groups, because obviously GPs, I don't know, they see people once every 10 minutes, don't they? And anaesthetists are the people that keep you alive. And then the lower stressed medics, like the pathologists who are dealing with dead bodies, and dermatologists. And they found that heart disease was greatest in GPs at 11.9% and lowest in dermatologists at 3.2%. So significant differences linked to stresses of the professions. And then the effect of stress on existing conditions, Shep et al. So stress can be fatal with those with an existing heart condition. So 173 men and women were given psychological tests, including a public speaking test. So obviously that's to invoke a little bit of anxiety. And they found that their blood pressure soared dramatically, and in half of them, the section of the left ventricle of the heart began to beat erratically. Of all the participants, 44% of those with erratic heartbeats died within 3 to 4 years, and only 18% of the rest. So psychological stress definitely can have an effect on heart health. Psychiatric disorders, obviously stress also having some response here. The Brown and Harris found that women suffering from chronic stress, so for example having more than 3 children under 14 at home, so you know that's half the nation at the moment, isn't it, with homeschooling, were more likely to suffer from depression. So that's where stress turned inwards. And working class women more prone to depression than middle class women having to return. So that obviously there's multiple pressures there, isn't there? For working class women, maybe 0-hour contracts, poorly paid, you know, there might be lots of other factors that are linking to stress that causes that. Post-traumatic stress used to be called shell shock in World War I. You know, then it moved to PTSD, so things like the Vietnam War, where people got flashbacks and nightmares and explosive moods. But and then you can see their role from Bennett found that PTSD symptoms caused by trauma. But what we now know, the more recent research is by Peter Levine and Gabor Mate and Bessel van der Kolk, is that trauma is now being redefined as not just big bad things happening to you, but it can also be smaller bad things. So for example, going under anaesthetic for an operation, or you know, bullying in a playground where you can't escape. That can cause post-trauma, and as sometimes can, for example, we've talked about attachment, and if you don't have a good enough attachment and you don't have a sensitive mother for at least some of the time, or caregiver, then that can be frightening for the child. So then that can be traumatic. So there's kind of new research coming out and new thinking about trauma. And then the stress diathesis model, again, we've looked at this a bit. It is the link where there's a link between the biological and the environment. So the suggestion that maybe some people have an underlying vulnerability to something which then is triggered by stress. So for example, maybe someone that hasn't a family link to, if I think of a family that I knew, there was definitely a family background of psychotic mental health issues, but the part of the family that I knew, it was during his finals where obviously his stress levels were really high, that it got triggered, and there was a combination of stress from multiple, being a student, being away from home, not having money, working hard for finals, and that stress then maybe triggered the onset of psychosis. So that's where there's something latent that triggered in the environment. Okay. So, what are some of the things that can cause stress for us? Well, here you can see this is called the social readjustment rating scale, and these are some of the life changes. So life changes are things like COVID is a life change, getting married, you can see their death of a close friend, pregnancy. And what they did was they allocated these units. So they said to people, right, if getting married is 50, how would you gauge the rest of them? And they attributed these numbers to them, the life change units, LCUs, life change units. And so, for example, death of a spouse was seen to be the most significant, 100 life change units, divorce 73. You can see they're married 50, because even though it's a positive life change, it still is a life change. You might be leaving home, you potentially changing your identity, you might have new friends, you've got to get used to living with someone new potentially. And down the bottom there you can see change of schools. It's still 20 life change units, because lots of different routines, different teachers. We know that when kids go from year 6 to year 7, their performance drops off, and I'm sure stress is part of that. And then Christmas, 12 life change units, because life is different at Christmas, isn't it? There's multiple stressors of money and presents, and whose parents are we seeing and whose parents aren't we seeing. And again, one of the interesting things during COVID was that a lot of those stresses seemed to be removed from people this year, because you just couldn't do all that stuff, so you had to kind of give it up. And so some people that I know reported that Christmas felt less stressful. So this was Holmes and Rahi, 1967, and they noticed that as medical doctors, they would notice that people would come to see them with serious illnesses, and that when they inquired, they'd experienced major life events. And these could be negative or positive, it doesn't matter, it's the extent to which change happens. And so they developed the SRRS, so they had 5,000 patient records, and they listed these 43 negative and positive life events, and they got 400 participants to score how much adjustment would be required by an average person. So for example, a daughter or son leaving home, how much adjustment would that mean for that parent whose kids left home? So adjusting to new routines, new budgets, maybe less time. So they used marriage as the arbitrary baseline of 50, and then got people, so the higher the adjustment, the higher the score. So the more you had to change. And then they were averaged to find the life change score. So you can see there's lots of kind of faults with that. You could argue it's all quite subjective. You could also argue it was quite a big sample, and it is a way of creating numerical data. It's also a way, I think, of cutting ourselves some slack at this time. So if you look at how we're all feeling about COVID, most of us will be dealing with at least some of those major life changes. So changing schools, and kids being home, so that's 20, isn't it? Or holidays is 13. And then some of us will be dealing with bereavement, which you can see quite high there. Some of us will be fired at work. We might be ill ourselves. So if you look at the multiple stressors that most of us are experiencing at this time, hopefully that just allows you to be a little gentler with yourself. So once they developed this scale, then they could look at whether that was positively correlated to illness. So they couldn't 100% say it caused it, but was there a link to it. Selye looked at 2,700 US male naval officers, and they were given the military version of this, because slightly different life change things, and they looked at their life events over the last 6 months, and then they calculated an illness score. So how many times have they been ill, how severely ill had they been, and they found a positive correlation, so a strong link that stress did link to illness. Okay, so it's really useful because we can research that and we can evidence it. And a piece of research by DeLongis in 1988 said 75 married couples were given life events questionnaire and a hassles and uplifts, we'll have a look at that in a bit, and found that there was no relationship between life events, but there were daily hassles. So daily hassles are things like losing your keys, like for me, someone coming to the door when I'm recording. They're little things, but over a lot of time, and on top of those bigger life events, they're like the straws that can break the camel's back. Of course, the social readjustment rating scale doesn't consider individual differences. So, for example, you know, your prior experience of death and bereavement, your prior background in bullying, or, you know, if you're used to living in a threatening area, that's very different from someone moving into a threatening area. And it was correlational, so it couldn't prove cause and effect, just prove relationship. And obviously it was asking people to think back on life events. So I'm sure you know that, you know, if you've ever been divorced or split up with someone, how it feels at the time when you're going through that feels very different afterwards, and then a long time afterwards. So a memory has an effect. So the daily hassles are the small things like, you know, I've done that before, dropped my phone down the toilet when I was on a parents' evening, or missing a bus, or losing a key, or, you know, having an argument, those sorts of little things, but they tend to happen more often. And they were looking at, for example, these things: how much does it stress you out spending time with your family, or your hair going wrong, or pets. And so the hassles and uplift scale was developed by DeLongis et al. And was looking at little things rather than big life events. And Boutieri et al. Investigated the relationship between daily hassles and mental health on French students, and results showed that 41% of the students suffered from depressive symptoms, and there was a positive link between hassles. So basically there was a link between hassles and depression. And then Gervais asked nurses to keep a diary for a month. They recorded their hassles and uplifts. The uplift is something that makes you feel good, and found that as daily hassles increased, so their performance went down. So, and then uplifts, as they went up, then performance went up. So as you would expect to see. And then Flett et al. Asked 320 men and women to rate support, and found that if they get support, the hassles kind of were better. Now you might think, why are hassles having such a big effect when they're such little things? And often if you think about life events like divorce or bereavement, often there's community rallying around, and people, you talk to people about it, and you get sympathy hopefully about it. Whereas a lot of these daily hassles, like someone ringing the doorbell when I'm putting this together, it's a small thing, nobody cares, you know, and there's no support group for being interrupted when you're recording. And a lot of parenting stresses are little daily hassles that, you know, you think, oh, who cares whether, you know, the yogurt pot went on the floor again, but actually it's the build-up of those small things that can have an effect. So again, it's the accumulation that seems to be stressful. So the more little stresses we have, they can build up. Life events tend to be rarer, and actually these little things can amplify big life events. So I remember when I got divorced, I went and had my eyebrows waxed, and it was the first time I'd ever had them done, and they were really much thinner than I'd been expecting, and I just sobbed, and the poor girl thought she'd done something wrong, and I couldn't stop sobbing, and it was really nothing to do with my eyebrows, it was everything else, but it was like the one small thing when everything else was building up. Okay. again, you know, thinking about daily hassles, we've still got the fact that it's retrospective data and it's based on memory. Yeah, and it's interesting gender differences. So again, you can't generalize. So men see pets as a hassle, whereas women saw them as an uplift. So workplace stress we've touched on a bit. So I might not go into this in too much detail. Yeah, Marmot's work is really interesting. So Marmot did some, so he's around, he's an epidemiologist, and he actually has been doing some stuff. He looks at how trends across populations. So epidemiology is looking at big patterns. So we're doing that with COVID, and that's how we've been able to identify that some populations, so some of the Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups are more predisposed to bad COVID. That's epidemiological research. And so Marmot's research in 1997 looked at workload and control, and he looked at 7,372 civil servants and assessed them for coronary heart disease, and found that there wasn't a link between workload and stress. So actually workload wasn't the thing. But what he did find is the higher grades had lower levels of heart disease. So he said it was to do with social support at the higher grades, but also control. And then Johansson in 1978, it was the Swedish sawmill. And what they did was they compared cleaners who literally just had to clean the factory and the sawmill finishers. So if you imagine the wood coming off, and this was polishing the finished product, and if they were at the end of a production line. So for the cleaners who just came in and cleaned the same every day, as the day went on, their stress levels were lower, and their stress levels were lower overall. And that was because they could go at their own rate. As the day went on, their job got less because they'd clean more, and they could tax people on the way round. So their stress levels were much lower. The sawmill finishers, they had high stress ratings even at the beginning of the day because they knew what was ahead of them, and their stress went up and up and up and up as the day went on because they got more tired. It was noisy, they had to keep up with the machines, and they didn't have any of the social contact. And this research was done, they used urine samples and blood to look at, they were measuring adrenaline and cortisol. So this was a really clear study to show that actually demands and control do contribute there. And then Pomansky et al. Showed that role conflict, so for example between work and home, can really cause that tension that we talked about. Okay, I don't think I'm going to go into those too much more. Yeah, questionnaires are often used to evaluate workplace stress, and people don't always want to write things down, do they? So it's suggested here that interviews are better as a way of getting information. Okay, how are we doing? Type A, we've already, so there's the research, just summarising again of Friedman and Rosenbaum. So type A wants to do less, competitive, hostile, linked to coronary heart disease, and then type B, easygoing, less likely to get it. And they did, this is what their research was, the Western Collaborative Group studied 3,000 men, notice, not women, and noticed the age boundaries as well, 39 to 59. They structured interviews and they were questioned in a provocative manner. So they questioned them in a stress-inducing manner to see what their responses were. And then after 8.5 years, twice as many type A people died of heart disease. And only 6% of type B. Type A had higher blood pressure and cholesterol, were also more likely to smoke. However, there was a follow-up study and found that of the 214 who had died of coronary heart disease, but that they didn't think there was a link between personality and death. Now, Hardy and Kobasa, we've looked at the 3 C's, and Kobasa, so control, commitment and challenge. Kobasa came up with this, looking at 800 business people, and she addressed them on the social readjustment rating scale, and looked at those that had the lowest stress scores, and they were the ones that had the hardiest personality. And you can actually do hardiness training because it's a cognitive behavioral technique that you can teach people how to do. Okay, so Lifton et al. In 2006 measured hardiness at 5 US universities and found those low on hardiness were more likely to drop out and higher hardiness more likely to complete a degree. One of the problems is, of course, most of the literature on this is self-report questionnaires where you're likely to get demand characteristics, people not necessarily telling the truth. Okay. Coping. So 2 types of coping: problem focused and emotion focused coping. So problem focused is if I've broken down, if I've got a flat tire, I might have a cry about it, but actually the main thing I've got to do is take control and I've got to fix that tire. So I've got to look at, am I going to get the RAC out? Am I going to do it myself? I've got to look at the pros and cons. I've got to focus on that. If I've got to suppress competing activities, I can't sit and scroll on my phone. I've just got to get my car fixed. That's problem focused. Emotion focused is, for example, so problem focused is finding out much about the problem, thinking about the best way to deal with it, and then avoiding the temptation to put it off. Emotion focused is where, so some people go into denial, like we've seen that with COVID, some people going into denial about it being a problem and wanting to kind of not think about it. Other people have been venting or shouting and crying. Some people go into wishful thinking. Christmas will be fine. There was a bit of magical thinking about Christmas, wasn't it? It'll be fine because it's Christmas. So emotion focused coping can be acted on, as if nothing's happening, crying or getting angry with others, dwelling on what might have happened or what should have happened. But also it can be good things. We can seek social support and emotional support, and social support can be both of those things. So if my neighbour comes along and helps me fix my puncture, then that might be problem focused and emotion focused, because they might empathise with me and get that fixed. So what they found was that strategies for coping with breast cancer, for example, having information and having some control, but also some support, was really useful. Okay. Emotion focus. So there's a real gender thing as well here, that women are more likely to do emotion focused and men are more likely to do problem focused. As anyone will know who's ever dealt with these in their relationships. Some emotion focused solving is not good because it can focus on the negative. So Lazarus and Faulkman found that emotion focused coping was useful when waiting for exam results, for example. There's no point worrying about the exam once you've done it. Just get on with it. And with dealing with anxiety provoking ways. So coping questionnaires, coping styles more appropriate for some stresses than others. So for example, fixing my car, I can sit and cry, but that's not going to get my car fixed. But on the other hand, bereavement, there is, there's nothing to be done. Someone's died, there is only really emotional. There might be things like clearing the house or getting the paperwork done, but actually that's an emotional stressor. And adolescents need to learn how to cope and have a variety of coping styles, and gender differences, as I've already said. Okay, we're going to stop there and we'll do treatments later.